Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Global Energy Forum. Build, build, build. The era of energy infrastructure, what a title. I actually can't wait for this discussion. This is really, really timely and really exciting. And when we got ready for our panel here, we had already a lot of discussions around the bottlenecks, the challenges, and the opportunities in terms of infrastructure build out in this era here in the United States, in Turkey, and in the UK and Europe. So I really can't wait for this conversation. And actually, we were joking, infrastructure build out might be a little bit like rolling the dice in this era. So before we get started, I have to do some housekeeping. So this session is on the record, and it will be live streamed. And we also encourage you to follow us on social media, tweet at us at hashtag AC Energy Forum and at AC Global Energy. And before I get started, I really just want to thank the whole team behind the scenes here at the Atlantic Council for their support. In particular, Frank Welly has really been helpful. I can't see him now, but without him, I wouldn't be able to moderate here. So I just want to thank him. And yeah, let's get right in it. Before I want to introduce my panel, I want to actually pose a question to all of you. It's a hand-raised question, so don't worry, you don't have to talk. But who here is optimistic about the infrastructure build-out until 2030? Raise your hand. So I don't know if you're being shy or, well, there's a hand over there. Okay, couple hands. Who is not optimistic? Okay, well, that gives us some data to start the conversation. Well, I'm so honored to welcome Pablo Koziner, Chief Commercial Officer at GE Vernova, here to my left, then Fuad Savaş, who is the co-head of Infrastructure Finance and Advisory at JP Morgan, Ben Wilson, who's the president at National Grid Ventures, and Lane Wilson, not related to Ben, who's the senior vice president and general counsel at Williams. So let's dive right in. And I'm actually going to start with you, Ben. We had a really important conversation about that demand is outpacing supply here in the United States, but also other places in the world, and the importance of transmission. So talk to us a little bit about how you're experiencing this at National Grid Ventures and what you think are the biggest opportunities and challenges in the future.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lee. And it's fantastic to be here, and thank you to the Atlantic Council. We've been involved with the Council for a fair few years now, and the convening power is just incredible. So real pleasure to be here. It's interesting to see the response from the audience around optimism around 2030. And I think probably people answered the question specifically because in transmission terms, 5 years is not a long time, right? So National Grid, we operate both sides of the Atlantic. We operate in the UK and in the Northeast US. We're more or less a 50-50 business. And we're a very large transmission company. We will spend $75 billion on building out our networks over the next 5 years, which makes us one of the largest investors in transmission in the world. So this is front and center for us. And I often say that the fact that transmission is on the critical path for building out the energy systems is not a bug, it is a feature. Because the whole system has been designed for a world where we've had low growth. And so in a low growth world, the exam question is, how do you stop utilities overbuilding? How do you stop utilities gold plating, over forecasting demand or over forecasting asset condition issues? How do you slow us down, right? How do you stop us building the stuff that doesn't need to be built? We're in a completely different world now. We're a relatively small part of the bill in most cases, but everything depends on us. So we're in a world now where the risk of not building is much more significant than the risk of building. So we need a paradigm shift in how we approach this stuff. And we're starting, I think we see a strong realization of this issue now, and AI has been a catalyst for that, right? I think collectively we're all realizing the name of the game now is load growth, is demand growth for AI, for other data centers, for reshoring, chip fabs, everything that's happening, this sort of new industrial revolution that we're going for. We need to be able to build. So there's a few things in that. System planning It needn't be too much of a problem that it takes longer to build the transmission line than it does to build the thing you're connecting it to if we're planning in advance. And things like FERC Order 1920 and the way the different states are responding to that, I think, is good. The UK actually has showed leadership in this area. We do have long-term system planning now. But if you've got a plan, you then need a regulatory system, economic regulation, that allows you to get on and invest with certainty. So we need investment regimes to respond to that. We need to deal with permitting. This is hard, and we have to balance the impact on local communities in a fair way. But you can still get to a fair outcome just more quickly. So we just need to speed this thing up. So there's a bunch of things there that I've mentioned, Lee. I could go on, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of them. But the key point is we need a paradigm shift.
Yeah, thank you for outlining your theory of change for this paradigm shift and what needs to happen. And I think that's what we're going to drill into. So maybe, Lane, I will go right over to you. One of the core bottlenecks are supply chains and long lead time equipment issues that I think all of us who are in the business of building infrastructure are experiencing right now, along with geopolitical tensions. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your perspective.
Yeah, so on the supply chain, we actually haven't seen that much of an impact at Williams on us, but look, companies are reshoring. They learned during COVID that the supply chains are relatively fragile. They want to have more control over that, and fortunately for us and the country as a whole, technology is providing a means to do that. Labor costs in countries that were historically extremely cheap are not as cheap as they used to be. So the sort of macroeconomic environment is not a bad one for reshoring. But as we do that, we've got to have more energy. And I think the main bottleneck that we're going to find out is going to be infrastructure to get that energy from the supply sources to the demand centers, no matter what that is. I mean, that could be wind or solar in Oklahoma that needs to be used somewhere else. But in the next 4 or 5, 6, 7 years, that's got to be natural gas. We're not going to build out nuclear quickly enough. We're not going to build out transmission lines quickly enough. But we can build out pipelines relatively quickly. And as Ben mentioned, the sort of key obstacle there is permitting reform. And so we've got to have permitting reform that allows us to build responsibly, and we've been doing that for decades and decades. But allows us to build very quickly. Something more akin to build and verify compliance, as opposed to spending 3, 4, 5 years in sort of a nonsensical circular loop about whether or not we're creating an issue for the environment. Because we can build pipeline infrastructure and other infrastructure very safely, in an environmentally friendly way, but we can also do that very quickly.
So thank you. Just making sure I heard you correctly. So what you're saying is we should be building out both pipeline and transmission infrastructure, so fuels and electricity, but what we can do faster is pipeline and fuels rather than electricity and nuclear at much longer lead times, including transmission?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is the only thing harder to build than a pipeline is an above-ground transmission line. Because people see it, they don't like it, they don't want it there, and to the extent we deal with NIMBYism, transmission power lines deal with it in spades. And I think we're going to learn that about the nuclear industry as well. There's a lot of momentum behind nuclear. We're supportive of an all-of-the-above approach. I'm personally supportive of nuclear, but when somebody finds out that nuclear is going to be built 5 or 6 miles down the road, we're going to encounter a lot of obstacles. We are able to get past those obstacles with natural gas. So I do think that natural gas can be built out much more quickly. And if we can reform our permitting, it's going to be even faster than we're doing right now.
All right. Well, we will definitely dig deeper into those perspectives. But first, one barrier that has not been mentioned on this panel is financing, though it's always being mentioned as the one barrier that's keeping us from building infrastructure. Fuad, maybe go to you to really assess that. How true is that narrative?
And you hear this complaint, especially in emerging markets, where people look at the vast sums that are needed. They look at a calculation. They say, oh, we need to mobilize, you name, 2 trillion, 3 trillion, however much. And they say, we must have a money problem. And this is not the case. And I cannot emphasize enough how untrue this is. In many emerging markets, in Thailand, in Malaysia, in South Africa, in India, in Brazil, it is cheaper to finance energy than it is in the United States. So to me, that is a great opportunity for these countries to really take advantage of the abundant liquidity, the desire of pools of savings to invest in infrastructure, to invest in energy infrastructure, the growing capital formation around infrastructure. And I think there's no money problem, but there's a human capital problem. So there's a planning problem, there is a political willpower problem, sometimes around permitting, around expropriation, and this is really pronounced in emerging markets. In the US, the world's largest importer of money, $1.2 trillion current account deficit, I think just goes to show everybody wants to be here. Everybody wants to invest in the US, and we, again, don't see signs of a shortage of funds. What we do see in the utility space, which I think is temporary, is some stress on ratings. Because when you think about utility ratings, it is how much debt do I have versus how much money I'm making, or any corporate rating. And we're going through a period of investment in the economy. This isn't just in energy, it's also in digital, it's also around onshoring, and this sort of theme of deglobalization. And as people invest, they're spending the money today, but the EBITDA comes 3, 4, 5 years down the line. So one of the challenges, I guess, particular to the US in this phase of growth, in this phase of investment, is how do I bridge that investment period without getting downgraded and without scaring away the bondholders? I think that's a temporary problem. Everybody's trying to come up with solutions to it, but I don't see money, I don't see financing as a bottleneck.
Okay, well, I want to go to you, Pablo. You told me that you're optimistic, not unlike the majority of our audience, about the infrastructure build-out. So take us home for this opening round. Why are you optimistic about the pace of infrastructure build-out?
Well, I am optimistic, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And the reason I'm optimistic, first of all, is that we're talking about energy in ways that, in my career, I haven't seen before. I mean, it's front and center. The importance of energy infrastructure is being discussed, and I think it's more widely appreciated. The second thing that makes me very optimistic is I'm starting to see an industry that has been very transactional move to more strategic. And just the people that I'm on the panel with here, Lane, Ben, and Folk, we're in active discussions between our companies about how we can come together and solve for a lot of the challenges related to growth. And that's just, some discussions involving a broader piece of the ecosystem, because we know that we're in an environment that is high growth, there's high demand, and there's a lot of constraint. And the best way to address that is to come together. And so I'm seeing partnerships between the private and public sector, between those that build and engineer, construct, that manage grids, and then we're talking about all the right things. The constraints are the ones that that Lane and Ben very adequately described, is that we need more regulatory reform. We need to accelerate permitting time so that these partnerships that are being established and these strategies can actually be executed in time periods that the markets need. And just, Lane, to your comments, I would just add litigation reform in this country, in the US. Part of our concerns, and it applies more to Ben and Lane, is that when they build stuff, frequently they get bogged down in having to argue about it. And that doesn't help either. So there really needs to be policy reform to enable the work that is being done by the private sector to come together and address the grid infrastructure that we need, the capacity additions that we need. I won't get into the numbers because we all know them. They're astronomical in terms of what we need. But it's a very positive environment in the sense that I do see a lot more collaboration. And I think when really smart people get together and they're working together to solve for these things, good things will happen. And the last thing I'll say is just from an order perspective at GE Vernova, our electrification business, which is mostly there to support the grid, and in terms of controls and HVDC and software, it's our fastest growing business, faster than even our gas power business, which is also seen a massive ramp. We have $123 billion worth of backlog. We did $35 billion in revenue last year. Think of the many years of work that we have to go out and execute. 20% growth year over year in the electrification side. So we're seeing investment. Now we need to see the execution.
$135 billion worth of backlog?
123
23.
was the last public statement. Yep.
Okay, that was the
You
last.
may know something I don't.
Okay, maybe I misheard, but I'm so curious about this. Tell me more. What's in that backlog, and why is it a backlog?
So there's equipment backlog, there's services backlog in there. So I'll take our gas power business, and I'll frame it in gigawatts of power. So for our large industrial gas turbine business, we have 29 gigawatts that are currently on order, and 21 gigawatts of what we have under reservation agreements. And those reservation agreements are pretty solid. Those will convert into orders. So that's 50, and we expect that will move into 60 gigawatts before the end of the year. That takes us out through 2028 in our capacity. And we're investing $300 million into our gas power business, 7 facilities in the US. That includes investments we're making in suppliers. So a 35% increase in our manufacturing capability, and we think by the end of the summer, there's a good chance that we'll be talking about slots into 2029. Not that we can't do things to help in certain cases, but the demand that we're seeing is very strong.
And so is that fast enough to meet rising demand? And this can be a question to anyone, but I'm just curious, if we're now talking 2029, it's now 2025, and yeah. Ben, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. Lane used the phrase all of the above. And I think that is the way that we need to think about this, right? We will do better, we will get to where we need to get to faster if we avail ourselves of the widest possible range of solutions, right? And different solutions have different strengths and different weaknesses. So solar, for example, is probably the quickest to market. If you just need electrons, right, that is probably the quickest thing to market. But of course, they're not firm, right? And so you need gas. So every different technology has strengths and weaknesses. I think we need an all of the above solution for generation. And then, as we said earlier, we need to think about ways to build out electric transmission, gas transmission, as quickly as we can in a way that is fair to the communities that have to host them.
And I want to follow up with you on one thing, Ben. You talked about planning. And the UK is a great example. I mean, the UK has been, over the past decade, I would say, consistently putting forward strategies for advanced energy tech, but also planning, investing. What do you see in the UK that you wish you could have here in the United States?
So it's not done yet. It's still a work in progress, but it is, it's real and it is having an effect. What we're starting to see is a golden thread through all the different stages that I mentioned, right? So we're lucky in the sense that, we're a single jurisdiction, right? The UK, we're like a very large US state, if you like. So we've got one system operator, one, national economic regulator. So we have a concept now where the system operator produces a strategic spatial energy plan and a network plan that sits behind it, right? They do that working with the transmission companies. That identifies where the strategic demand will be, what transmission, electric, gas, and also hydrogen will be required to meet that mix. And then importantly, what that plan does, it then creates a presumption of need in the permitting system. So then the discussion is not so much about, do we need this project or not? It's already been identified as needed. It's about mitigation, compensation at that point. It triggers the backing from the economic regulator. So again, the discussion with the regulator at that point then is, well, how much is this going to cost? Not, do I need to fund it or not? So it triggers a cascade of events. And as an example of that, we traditionally in the UK, transmission, we're regulated on a 5-year kind of periodic price control basis. Every 5 years, we go back for a new rate case. We just did, outside of the normal 5-year regulatory cycle, something called ASTI, Accelerating Strategic Transmission Infrastructure, 17 new transmission lines approved by the regulator outside of the normal process, triggered by the system operator's need, and very importantly also with an ability to make long lead commitments to the supply chain. So we can go out and we can put up to 10, 20% of the project cost out with the supply chain before we've negotiated the final cost allowances with the regulator. So this is fundamental change, which is in place today now and is making a real difference. It's one of the reasons why our 5-year CapEx program is so much larger than it was in the previous 5 years.
Well, thank you so much for outlining this impressive case study where I think other governments should really look. Lane, were you going to come in on this topic?
Yeah, I think we need to keep in mind, one, Pablo would rather sell a gas turbine this year than next year. So I wouldn't underestimate American industry's ability to produce things faster than they maybe think they can produce right now. And we're sitting on, in this country, such massive natural gas reserves. The only thing that is preventing us from addressing reliability, affordability, and clean energy is getting the infrastructure needed, which includes Pablo's turbines, from those gas fields to the point of demand. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of what happened last year. Because of affordability and lack of reliability, we had a change in this country politically. And I think that that politicians on both sides are recognizing that if they ignore reliability and they ignore affordability, they do so at their own peril. And I think that's going to result, that's why I'm optimistic. I think it's going to result in some permitting change. I think companies like GE Vernova, I think companies like Grid, I think companies like JP Morgan who provide the capital are going to be able to give us the push we need, provide the infrastructure and the backing we need to build these things out in this country. And in the next 5 or 6 years, that's going to have to be natural gas. We will fold in on top of that nuclear at some point, and we will continue to fold in solar and wind. But if we don't do it with the resource we have now, then we're in trouble. And I think that the politicians are beginning to see that.
And you've talked a lot about the U.S. domestic market, but I think the Europeans are also looking to the U.S. to fulfill some of their gas demand. Is the U.S. in a position to supply that rising demand, or what do we need to realize that infrastructure? You're smiling, so that keeps me optimistic.
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but we have more than enough gas to supply the Europeans, to supply our own needs. The question is, can we get that gas, for example, from the Marcellus to the Atlantic coast to new LNG facilities, or even down from the Haynesville down south onto new LNG facilities? If we can do that, we have more than enough gas to provide the Europeans with all they need, and we will not see much of a change in gas price.
Okay, and I want to talk about affordability in a second, because I think we're throwing out billions and billions of dollars of energy infrastructure, but we also need to kind of understand how to keep it affordable. But Fouad, I do want to go to you. We've talked about the UK, we've talked about Europe, emerging markets in particular. You've touched on this already, lots of infrastructure investment going on. Maybe you can talk a little bit about Turkey, which I think you mentioned has an ambition to become an energy corridor and is investing a lot in infrastructure, but also super ambitious and has some real good flagship projects.
For background and disclosure, I'm Turkish, hence this question. Turkey's doing a lot of things, right? So the long-term planning is there. The ambition is there. All of the above approach, from nuclear to gas to renewables to hydro, is there. And Turkey as an energy corridor makes sense. So we're at JP Morgan, and also personally, we're very bullish on Turkey. Energy corridor, you've a massive amount of renewables in Saudi Arabia. Something that happened over the past year that was very exciting is Saudi connected to the Iraqi grid. The Turks are working on connecting or increasing the connections to the Iraqi grid on their side. So you can think of a future where you have Saudi renewables basically interconnected to European grid. Gas pipelines, similarly, they're obvious for obvious reasons. Gas pipelines from Russia are on hold, but there are other Turkish gas pipelines already connected to Europe via the Trans-Anatolian system and through a Bulgarian connection. And there's also talk about Trans-Caspian now energy corridor with, how do you get the stranded gas in Turkmenistan or turn it into power, turn it into electrons and get it to Europe. So it's a country that I think is a little bit of an exception to what I started off with. In a lot of the world, there's too much money chasing too few projects. In Turkey, it's usually the other way around. There are too many projects, not enough money. And we see that potential. One thing I hear from investors, from equity investors, especially foreigners, is that it is not a level playing field. So the Turkish government can do a little bit of work making the rules apply evenly to everyone. And so there's room for improvement there. But from our perspective, we're very bullish. We're investing in Turkey, and there's a lot more to do.
And overall, the Mediterranean, what other opportunities do you see there? So I'm asking because we have a conversation about this actually later.
Well, the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean is a very complicated spot. So you can say, well, people have spoken about getting pipelines and transmission lines from Egypt via Greece to Europe, and Turkey would say, actually, those two countries don't share a naval border, so I don't know how you would do that without going through our territory. People have spoken a lot about the opportunities for Europe, and Mediterranean and trans-Mediterranean is really a part of that, not just in the Eastern Mediterranean where there have been these large gas finds, but also with Northern Africa, with grid connections, with renewables connections. And it's been disappointing to me not to see those projects come online and progress at the rate that a master planner would push them. But there's immense opportunity there for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for this perspective. And I think that's one aspect we need to keep in mind. We're seeing a lot of project announcements or giant, huge interconnection queues, but not all of these projects are actually going to be built, right? So we have to keep that in mind, and I think that's what actually keeps me up at night. But I want to go back to our topic before, energy affordability, right? You mentioned this may actually determine the political destiny in the United States. So I'd love to hear from all of you. We're talking a lot about enormous numbers. We're also seeing the price of key inputs such as steel go up as a result of geopolitical tensions and trade barriers. So how do we navigate really keeping energy infrastructure at an affordable cost so we can pass affordable costs on to the consumers? Maybe Pablo, we'll start with you. Big question.
Yeah, look, I think if you're in an environment where things are surging, your costs are going to go up. And so it emphasizes the need for, and this is a key word, I'm sure everybody has heard it or is using it, as certainty. And when you have certainty over long periods of time, end of decade, going into 2040, because in our business, 2028, 2029 is a today issue. And so as we plan, if we can move into an environment where we're planning more strategically, we're planning in phases, that allows us to manage supply chains in a different way than running over to a supplier and asking for more. You show up sweating and you know the answer you're going to get. So it's just what Lane was talking about. And Ben, I think with the UK government gives you certainty. You turn around and you invest more. You're going to do it in a very orderly, predictable way that's going to help you manage costs. So when you have visibility in terms of what the build can look like over a longer period of time, when you have certainty in terms of policy and regulation, when you are able to take all these strategies and execute it in a more orderly way, that's going to help cost.
Okay, let me follow up on this. Where do you feel like you have certainty right now in the U.S. context, and where would you like to see more certainty?
Where we have certainty is the stuff that we can see immediately. So immediate demand gives us certainty in terms of what people need in the next 12, 18 months. But that goes back to this comment on surging. We're seeing a lot of constraint. We're seeing a lot of stress on the need for equipment and services. What I would like to see, especially in the area of artificial intelligence and data center build out, this is an area that could use more planning in longer intervals of time. There is certainly a lot of stress on trying to get power immediately from the grid, from available resources. We see this all over. But these projects that are being, the pipeline of projects that are being built out, this is where we could have better overall system planning and a more coordinated effort in terms of how these things are brought to market and for who and how, and that is going to help with the cost issue.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm hearing that we're asking for more planning and kind of more line of sight into timelines, so that's very helpful. Fouad, going to you, Also on the aspect of financing, perhaps how much does financing play into costs of infrastructure?
I think it depends on the technology in question. So if you think about the one extreme is nuclear, where nuclear and solar share similarities. You have some upfront costs, you have basically free fuel, very low O&M, and so the upfront financing cost and the period over which that is amortized is extremely, extremely important. And so for solar, which is an established technology, it's very, very low risk. The private sector has realized, okay, I can lend at the cheapest rate to this type of technology. I think there are people who think that will happen with nuclear. I'm not one of them. So I think as there is a nuclear renaissance in this country and around the world, it is important for planners and the governments to do the math and understand that if the private sector were to finance large-scale nuclear, it would be unaffordable. So around affordability, large-scale nuclear is something that will need very long-dated, very cheap government money. That is one extreme. On the other end, with technologies with more of an ongoing fuel cost, like natural gas, financing is important, but it's not critical. And very frequently, you see people choose the expensive but more expedient financing over something that might take a little bit of time to put together, but is ultimately cheaper.
And why would they choose the more expensive financing in the near term?
I'm sorry?
And why is that choice being made? And then
because
also,
it's more expedient. So they might say, look, this is going to be a peaker. I need this in place before the summer. And so let me put my financing together in an expedient way, even though it's more expensive. It's not a massive factor as it is with solar or with nuclear.
Understood. And Ben, over to you. I think you've been waiting to
Yeah,
chime in.
I mean, I think on affordability, I'll probably add 3 points to the points that have already been made. Firstly, just to build on Pablo's comments about long-term certainty, where we do get that visibility as a utility in terms of system planning and then confidence that the regulator will then follow that planning, it does allow us to put out those big orders. So we have announced very large framework agreements. We're talking 50, 60 billion pound type headline framework agreements for cables, for transformers, for HVDC technology. And what we're finding is absolutely up to 2030, 2031, 2032, there's real bottlenecks. But after that, we're starting to see a bit of daylight, actually, as the certainty that we and others have provided is starting to allow the supply chain to invest in more capacity. So we are seeing, I'd say, a bit of light at the end of the tunnel coming from that. Second thing I'd mention is, you mentioned interconnection queues. Reform of interconnection queues so that the right projects are prioritized, real projects with land rights, with offtake, with supply chain contracts, with financing, that those projects are prioritized ahead of zombie projects, which are just booking the place in the queue, right? And there's, in every jurisdiction, people are working through this. And then the last thing I would say, I mentioned that it's the cost of not building is more than the cost of building. And you might think that just sounds like a sort of nice soundbite. But to give you a really concrete example of that, in the UK, annual constraint payments to generators that are available to produce but cannot because of grid constraints are more than the total transmission cost, right? So if we built out the grid and reduced constraint costs, it essentially comes for free. So the cost of not building now really is more than the cost of building.
Thank you so much. And Lane, going over to you, since you brought us onto this conversation, please, your perspective on how we can keep costs low and ensure affordability.
Yeah, so we spend about the same amount or more, sometimes twice as much more on permitting than we spend on steel. You look at our projects that we're building today and you go back 20 years, it's a very similar project going through a very similar area. We are spending 10 times as much on permitting. So that is free costs you can eliminate. And I can tell you 90% of that cost is not moving the needle on the environment. It's not moving the needle in terms of landowners. It is simply built-in costs. As a lawyer, maybe I should be happy about this, but that's who's making all the money on this. And that's who benefits. So again, we get back to streamlining permitting reform. Those are free costs you can take out of the system. We don't have a capital problem. We can finance our projects at a very low capital cost. And certainty generally isn't an issue for us as well, but the problem is that certainty is 4 or 5 or 6 years out, and it ought to be 2 years out. And all of that adds cost to the system.
And how can certainty come closer to you in time? What would be some effects you'd like to see?
Well, I mean, Pablo mentioned the litigation risk. We built a project in 2017, and earlier this year we finally resolved the last lawsuit. That project has been in service since 2018. And that litigation, more so now than it was in 2017, is something we think about as a company in terms of whether or not we're willing to take on a project. And so reducing that risk, again, streamlining the permitting process, that could, I think we could probably shave 2 years, 3 years off of the planning process, which makes it easier for us to make a return. It means that Ben's customers in the regulated market are going to pay less, and it means more capacity, frankly, for the natural gas markets.
Yeah, thank you so much for this additional perspective. I want to go to a question that, Fuad, you called meaty earlier, and it's about China and what can we learn from China, because China is really focusing on building infrastructure out a lot at a really fast pace, and effectively we're seeing the announcements every day in the news. So I'd love to invite your perspectives on this. Pablo, can I start with you?
I think that what we can learn from China is that speed to infrastructure is possible. It comes from strategy and planning. I'm not saying it's cost effective, the returns that we would expect in the Western world, but China has a very focused strategy to increase their infrastructure capabilities, to be a leader in energy and industry. They certainly are on a path to try and develop very significant artificial intelligence capability. It's a national priority, and you can see how things are being executed. We struggle with going from strategy to decision to speed. And so if there's a page out of their playbook is to have government play a role that is more directive and I wouldn't, maybe directive is not the right word, but more of a facilitator to allow for faster execution.
Yeah, so strategy, decision, speed. I like that framework. So that's for our theory of change. Fuad, you're already...
I'm going to echo a lot of that. Sam Altman at OpenAI said, I think he tweeted about this, that over time, the cost of intelligence will converge on the cost of energy. So if you believe AI to be a fairly existential technology, you would look at this and say, okay, this is in the national interest, and we're going to do A, B, and C to ensure that our models and our inference, et cetera, has the most affordable, plentiful technology. So is the US acting like it believes in this? The answer is no. There's been a lot of talk for a few years now around rare earths and critical minerals. This was not just the current administration, also the previous administration. Was the administration acting like that was a national interest priority? No. So China is good at saying this is a national interest, and we will act in accordance and give this area the priority it deserves. And even though we may be nowhere in that area today, 15, 20, 25 years from now, we will dominate that supply chain and that technology. And that long-term planning, long-term commitment, and aligning national interests with political action, that's something that I think every country can learn from China.
And let me throw in, before we go to you, Ben, if we had this kind of long game approach, which you also already outlined for the UK, would that add certainty?
I think, yeah, we can put a note of optimism on that. I think if we, as I think increasingly we are now doing, because we feel in the West, we feel the urgency which is moving us to do this. If we do think strategically, if we make long-term plans accordingly, and then crucially set up the mechanisms so those plans result in action, right? Then then we've taken from that playbook. But then you add on the strengths that we have where the West does lead around innovation, diversity of thinking, the incredible, I mean, we have a corporate venture capital fund based in California. It's one of the largest in the energy space. Just the incredible tech and innovation ecosystem that we have in the West, and particularly in the United States. If you can combine those unique advantages that the West has with some of that long-term strategic planning, why can't we win?
Yeah. Lane?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that we spend this much capital, intellectual capital, talking about energy. I mean, we really need to just take it off the table in terms of a political issue. When people have more energy, more access to cheap energy, they do better, they perform better, but you better human lives, and you get better decision making, and then you can take better care of the environment. And the other thing I'll say is we also need to sort of change our perspective. In many ways, we're still living in the 50s. We're acting like if the private sector is allowed to go out there and build a ton of infrastructure, you know, the rivers are going to be polluted and we're going to have smog in the air. That just simply is not the case. And so let's take it off the table. Let's make it a bipartisan issue. We'll let the Republicans and Democrats argue about the size of the government and how big the welfare state ought to be. And let's just get back to building things.
All right, so in these final moments of this panel, I do want to ask you one more lightning round question to all of you. And I'll start with you because you already kind of paved the way, Lane. But if you had one ask to the government right now, what would it be?
Get out of our way.
And how would they do that?
I mean, so I'll talk again, you know, natural gas is our business. And so we have sort of this matrix of permitting that we have to go through to build an interstate pipeline. And we actually have a flow chart at Williams that shows this matrix. And I promise you, none of you could follow it. It is labyrinthian. And so we just need to eliminate the permits that are duplicative. Clean Water Act 401 is an example. We have FERC analyzing water quality, and then we have a state analyzing water quality. They both do it. They both effectively have a veto on the project. Let's do that once. If we can begin with that process, and then we can continue to look at the permitting process, then the government, I mean, look, we have private companies that want to build out energy infrastructure, right, which is going to make energy less expensive. So if we can just methodically walk through that permitting process, walk through the litigation process, and say what's adding value, what's not adding value, eliminate the things that are not adding value, and do that congressionally, like build that into the law, then that's what I mean when I say get out of the way.
Thank you so much. Ben, your biggest ask to any government, UK or the US.
Yeah. Lean in hard into regional transmission planning and inter-regional transmission planning. There's not enough interconnection between the different transmission reasons. And then focus on permitting reform, as Lane has said, and set time limit deadlines. Set a goal as to how long it should take to get permitting, and then drive through to make sure that permitting doesn't exceed that time.
Start planning around national interest priorities and let us know what the plan is.
So it's a wish, but we all have seen human behavior be at its best when you're in a time of crisis. People put their agendas to the side and they come together and they get incredible things done. And so how do we create an environment where energy is a unifying strategic priority, which echoes all the comments that were mentioned before? Because if you talk to any individual legislator, politician, you typically get a very well-informed, good, rational answer, typically. The issue is trying to bring all the people together that you have to and get the machine to work in a coordinated, unified way. So my wish would be that this is taking energy, the build-out of critical infrastructure is really seen as an emergency, and that it unifies in ways that we can get things done.
And I have to ask a quick follow-up. Do you think some of the recent, what we've seen in the Iberian Peninsula, the blackouts, and also in the US, what we've experienced is already driving some of that urgency? Or what do you think needs to happen for the government really to feel that urgency?
So I thought it would. In Spain, Portugal, and the European just the infrastructure. I thought there would be a quicker call to action. Maybe Ben can comment on this. I think in Spain, they're still, trying to figure out who's going to take the blame for what happened. There's a lack of inertia in the system. There needs to be more resiliency. That was immediately discovered. But we thought that the next day, there would be phone calls in terms of, hey, we're going to do this for the grid, and let's do some studies. And I think we're still, it's that lack of a unified approach. But Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, I think we're still waiting for, I think, ENSOE to publish some firm conclusions, but I think it's reasonably clear what some of the drivers are. I think what I would say is it is a reminder that, we often talk about the trilemma, right? Reliability and availability of energy, affordable energy, and then sustainability. It is a reminder that the most important thing is reliability, right? If you don't have that, nothing else matters. That is the most important thing, and it's a serious business. And that's why we need to invest and make sure that we have reliable, affordable, plentiful energy.
Yeah, just to repeat the affordability aspect of it, I mean, Pablo, I couldn't agree with you more. I thought something would happen, but I think when people start seeing $50 or $100 a month added to the utility bills every month, I think that's going to create the emergency.
Fua, do you want to? Okay, well, I just want to thank you all so much, Elaine, Ben, Fuad, and Pablo, for this wonderful panel and engaging in a range of perspectives from around the world. What really stuck with me is, Ben, you opened the panel, we need a paradigm change, and we need to cut through some of the conventional narratives, in particular on financing, strategy, decision, speed. I think that is a framework we all should be taking home and taking to our governments, and then what can we really get done in the near term to alleviate some of the strain, and then how can we plan out for a more long game approach, which, Lane, I think you really elaborated well on. So I am conscious that we are the only ones standing between you and the coffee break. So thank you all so much for joining us here at the Global Energy Forum, and please enjoy your coffee break and the next 1.5 days.